Welcome to the Yale Centre for British Art's online series, At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Karen Alexander, an independent film and moving image curator, writer, and researcher. I'm delighted to welcome Ibrahim Mahama to our programme today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping points. Please note that this programme will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the programme. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Ibrahim, and they will be answered at the end of the programme. But please do feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live script is available by clicking on the icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shigadakoke, Golden Hill Pocasset, Niantic, Quimpiac, and other Algonquin-speaking people who have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people, these nations, and this land. I'll just say a few words about Ibrahim Mahama before we actually start the presentation. And just to say, we're going to have some slides that we're going to be talking about after I've introduced Ibrahim. Ibrahim Mahama was born in Ghana. He is a painter and sculptor who uses the transformation of materials to explore themes of commodity, migration, globalization, and economic exchange. His installations and wall-based works consider the ways in which capital and labor are expressed in common materials. Often made in collaboration, Mahama creates large-scale installations with wood and metal remnants gathered from urban environments, or jute sacks that once carried cocoa, but now charcoal, and are synonymous with Ghana's trade. He is best known for draping buildings in sacks that he and his team stitched together to create patchwork quilts. These immersive installations in art spaces and public markets draw attention to the global transportation of goods and provide critical reflection on the value system inherent in his materials. Mahama's works have appeared in numerous international exhibitions. He was the youngest artist featured in the Ghana Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Biennale. He lives and works in Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale in Ghana. Welcome, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Karen.
Could we have the first slide, please? So, Ibrahim, I've got this slide here, partly because I think it's quite interesting for people to really hear about you and your education, and specifically your arts education, because I think I've said to you on a number of occasions when we first met that you were one of the very few younger artists that I'd met from Africa who had done all of their arts education in the country of their origin. And so I was very interested in that and thinking about, I suppose, what that meant, what that art school was about. And I was very pleased to come and see you and to visit the art school and meet your tutors and see other people who were there. And I was just wondering whether you could say a little bit about, I suppose, what I would think of as a sort of like a radical overthrow of arts education that took place at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi. So could you just say a little bit about the development of the department that you eventually ended up graduating from, and I think are still studying in?
Yeah, I'm currently on a PhD program at the university. And I enrolled into the program in 2006 to do my undergrad in painting and sculpture, but I specialized in painting and eventually went back to do the MFA in painting and sculpture. But the reason why I decided to study there, particularly in the beginning, was because In Ghana, that was basically the only school where you could go to have a degree program in painting and sculpture, in the fine arts program. We had a University of Ghana where you have the fine arts program, but more towards performing arts. Whereas at KNUSC, you could do painting, sculpture, or graphic design or something. But I was interested in the fine arts program. And unlike our predecessors, of course, like in the early 2000s, there was a new crop of professors, Dr. Caricature Seydu, together with like Kisiedu Puafo and other professors who had come into the program. Like they also studied at the university. They had studied with the old curriculum because it's the initial curriculum was based on the old Han and I British curriculum. So the program was quite conservative for many years. It didn't really allow for much imagination within the program in terms of how artists were practicing or being taught how to practice. So you could find a generation of artists, and all of them, it looked like they all thought alike or made the same kind of. Whereas, if you look at our history of our education in relation to, let's say, the history of politics or material developments and other things, you realize that there were so many other things that were happening, all the crises and failures. They were not really thought about like materially in relation to the production of art. So if an artist was to take a subject and to produce it in an artistic form, it was always borrowing from the visual representation of the subject matter and then translating it into a painting or into a sculpture or something like that. Whereas within this new radical arts production, the decay, failures, historical forms, material productions and everything, labor became, even the politics of labor became the starting point in which artists could begin to rethink about ways in which they could relate to art and all the production systems attached to it. So in the previous regime, it was more or less about the production of, let's say, pictures, whereas in our regime, it was more or less about the reconstitution of the image and then trying to look at what it means to be able to produce anything. So even if you are a painter, doesn't necessarily, and you're studying painting and you're studying colors and everything, doesn't necessarily mean that if you have to depict an idea, you have to go back to using the paint and brush, or you could somehow use a constellation of different things that exist around you, whether in the past or jumping into the future or borrowing from a discipline, photography or sound or poetry. In the previous regime, that was not possible. So for us, I think that's what empowered us. And Black Star Lines, which is the collective body, which was started by Caricature Seydu, which has the student body and then also the professors and also other comrades within it. That's how it all came about, that the idea that we know the condition that we're in. And it's not as if when you decide that you're going to go to the US, of course, we encourage, because one of our comrades, Alvin, he actually studies at Yale. He graduated recently. And even when we're establishing SCCA Red Clay, he's been with us. And even in Kumasi, he's helped us with all the design, production. He designed the SCCA logo, Red Clay, Nkrumah. So the idea is that we want to build a generation of artists who are not just artists who are producing objects or commodities, but they are people who are also producing ideas, and they are also producing different sets of things that become like a whole. It's like a generation of responsibilities in a way. That was a radical point that this program brought about.
Yeah, and I'm interested really in how that sort of like sense of collaboration sort of worked its way into the practice, and also I suppose not just within the student body but also with the lecturers and also communities both within the university and outside the university, because I think that that was important to you as well.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
So
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, no, I did. I was just wondering whether you could, because I think, you know, a lot of your work is based on collaboration, and collaborations that isn't just about working with artists that you have studied with, but actually with different types of communities. I was wondering whether when Black Star Lines was set up and, you know, the student-led initiatives were set up, whether that was a sort of like, I suppose, an important part of the, you know, informal manifesto of operation.
Yes, it was. For us, it wasn't so much about just the student's body, but it was more or less about getting out of the art school and going into like the city or to the countryside or wherever we could get inspiration from. In one of the commencement speeches that was given at the University of Ghana at Legon, back then during the regime of Kwame Nkrumah. He once made a statement that he thinks that it is time for the gown to go to town. It inspired the title of an exhibition that Black Star Lines organized at the Science Museum in Accra for the students back in 2015. But we made it imperative, the gown must go to town. But the idea that when we find ourselves within these academic environments, at some point when we are finished, we have to somehow go back into the city, into the communities, into the countryside, the places where the masses are, and find ways in which we can collaborate and work with them to be able to build a new trajectories or new societies or things like that. And for us, then again, in school, it wasn't so much about finishing, but it was always about the idea of realizing that radical ideas that could somehow shift artistic perspectives was already existing. And if you go to the market or other places in a metal workshop or in farms, you could realize that people were using like ideas, whether they were indigenous ideas or like new intellectual labor forms, in order to be able to create different display forms or constitutions of different things that could allow them to be able to carry out their everyday existence. And for us, those were important in somehow allowing us to reshape contemporary art in terms of the form that it would take, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of articulation and also in terms of how people could inherit this in terms of audience and how we could draw people into the discourse of, let's say, contemporary art and culture.
Okay, great. So Malik, maybe we can move on to the next slide that should be looking at an exhibition called Fragments, which took place in 2017 at White Cube. I suppose this is a version of the town coming into the gallery itself. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, what are the titles? Because I think there's quite a lot of meaning in the titles of the pieces of your works. So could you just say a little bit about this piece?
Yes, a lot of the titles from the pieces were either coming from some of the collaborators that I was working with, or they were coming from titles of songs that were inspired by labor conditions and also just like ordinary everyday today lives made by musicians over the last decades. So Ziza Sulu was a combination of different names that I had used within the naming of this work, because the initial production of the jute sacks was me collecting these materials, jute sacks that had been used originally to transport cocoa and then later on used to transport charcoal and other materials. As a student, I was interested in the idea of the stain and the scarifications within these materials. So I would collect them through a series of exchanges and then also collect like metal tags, which were collected by these guys at this place called Achimota Station meticulously. And then through very painful labor processes, they would repair them and then put these jute ropes on them, which we could use to re-stitch and create these aesthetical points within the material. And there was also these other materials that were made up of like tarpaulins, like canvas materials that were used for transportation of goods, covering trucks originally, but later on used and covering engine parts. And then they will become these really dark black canvases. And I thought it was really interesting to create these compositions because the exhibition Fragment was also a title I had borrowed from a Ghanaian writer, Ibrahim. And it also talks about the conditions of like people within a certain period within the history of Ghana and all that. So I thought that it was actually very interesting to be able to like at least combine the inspiration with the forms that I was working with.
So Malik, could you run through some of the images that are there, because it sort of has a bit closer, it gives examples of some of the work.
Yeah.
On to the next one.
So some of these, like this one, for instance, is a detail of railway, some of the trains that were used in Ghana in the pre-independence and just post-independence era. Some of the trains which I was interested in collecting as part of the projects I was doing at Red Clay, buying train parts, airplanes, and then converting them into pedagogical spaces, allowing the decay and also the histories within those spaces to speak to us. So I was also collecting the remnants and residues, memories within these materials and using them for new forms of composition. So in the exhibition, Fragments was one of the very early stages at which I make some of these compositions within the context of,
and you're making
the show.
Sorry to interrupt you. You're making those compositions with sort of like quite clashing materials, but they have some relationship, don't they? It's either historically or from where they actually come from. So Malik, can you just go through? I think there's a few more of these images. I mean, the things that are sort of like very beautiful, I mean, I find them very sort of beautiful to look at. So is this leather and jute?
Yes.
Yeah. And when you're putting them or sort of like suturing these materials together with your collaborators, is it very arbitrary, or do you sort of like plan out roughly how things are going to go?
I don't know. Sometimes you have an idea of what it should look in your mind, but it doesn't really go how you plan it to be, because compositionally, if you put two materials together and in your mind it looks like they could look good together, but physically, aesthetically, it doesn't look good. So you reshift, and then we shift things around until we are like, oh, maybe this composition works, and then we would sew it together. But sometimes you would even sew it together, and 2 days later you open it up again and you're like, it doesn't look good. We unstitch everything and then you start all over again. So it depends. It's, I guess, one of the big confusions in the program at Kumasi at some point was that some of the older generation of artists and professors thought that the newer generation, they were somehow making arts, the arts program a lot more degenerate, because they were encouraging students to use materials which were not conventional. And that was going to somehow take away from the purity of art practice as it existed before. But it's not so, because the thing was that we needed to give ourselves time to understand materials and how those materials could work. For instance, the jute bags are normally used to transport cocoa. And traditionally, the cocoa was supposed to be transported by the trains to go to the silos that were built in the independence era by Kwame Nkrumah, so to be stored in it for later international trade. But none of those ever happened together with the expansion of the railway. So today, if you have the jute bags which are being used and then they are being discarded, and you also have trains which have historical memories which are being discarded, and then you decide to put those two materials together because of the state of decay that they are in, it could be quite difficult for people to understand those compositions. But within a more building new art historical forms and context, that was really important, particularly for maybe another generation to have a different point of entry into understanding the significance of, for instance, these kinds of connection.
Equally, I think even if you didn't know that, looking at something that you're familiar with in one setting intrigues why, you to think about, what's going on being used here, or what's he doing with this material.
Yes.
And so I think that sort of like, heavy weight of and very loaded nature of the material that you use, I think is really, is really fascinating, because, as you say, they're sort of like steeped in history and memory, and yet they're sort of like sliding and sort of, in time against and next to each other. Malik, could you go to the next slide? I can't quite remember. In the next one. And the next one. Great, thank you. So I remember seeing this piece at the White Cube, and I just couldn't take my eyes off Ibrahim. It's made up of, I don't know how many shoe boxes. One,
Shoemaker boxes.
One, could you explain the title? And then two, could you explain your fascination using this form of material to make this sculptural piece?
Yeah, so the Shoemaker boxes was one of the early materials I was interested in objects. I collected the first box in 2000 and can't remember exactly, but I was doing my MFA. It was in 2014 or 13, one of those dates. Yeah, I was very much, because in Ghana, when you're traveling around, there are so many boys who travel from, for instance, Kumasi and other places to come, and then from the eastern region and other parts, and they engage in this practice shoemaking where they buy these boxes, and then some of them make them from like remnants of wood that they find in the city, and then they go around every morning with like a set of tools in it, and then they hit the box to make these sounds to invite people to bring their broken shoes, or if they need to polish their shoes. And I was very fascinated by it as an object because it looked like a compressed large architectural structure. And I also liked the idea of the damages within them because of they hit it all the time. So it started having these kind of scars and bruises on them. And the interesting thing is that the guys who use this small houses as boxes, most of them sleep on the streets. So I was interested in how the contradiction of like the reality that they were finding themselves in, but at the same time, how the reality, the conditions that they were in was somehow steeped within the character of the box. So I was originally collecting them and combining them with like these tattoos on the hands of some of the collaborators I work with. And I made these early photographs out of them. And when the show for White Cube, when I started working with White Cube in 2015, when we started planning on doing the show at Bermondsey, I said to myself, why not collect many more of these boxes, and why not expand even the aesthetics of the box? So I started going to like the railways, collecting residues from the trains, train parts. I went to old factories that were built in the colonial times, post-independent time, factories that were being demolished. I collected parts from those and making some of the newer boxes. And I even made a lot of the newer boxes in these factories. I took the internal parts of the factory, almost like extracting the internal organs, and then remaking them into these boxes. So because of the aesthetics of the factory and the wood, the documents and everything, when you looked at it, the new box that was made in relation to the old boxes that I was collecting, you couldn't tell any difference between them. And for me, that was where the interest was in. I was interested in how I could bring my training and history as a painter to somehow create these new paintings. So it's almost like going back to the history of cubism or whatever, but this time you were not making a cubist painting, but you were somehow taking an entire structure and deconstructing and putting it back together in such a way that each plane within the object had a very different composition, a different color patination or whatever. So I thought it was, and so I named it non-orientable in cancer, because one of the collaborators I was working with was so called in cancer, and he was always accusing us in the studio, my assistant and I, Benjamin, at the time, that we were making these Shoemaker boxes that at the time it was closer to the elections when we're making it. And there was this whole propaganda that one of the opposition parties, the parties was getting people from like Togo to come into Ghana to come and vote. And because, when people are crossing the border casually, when they're selling things or their local trades, they're holding a box and they're crossing across the border. You don't question them. So like, oh, we're making these boxes to give to these people so they can cross the border. It was so ridiculous. So I decided through the antagonisms that merged, I decided to somehow name the piece non-rentable in cancer, non-rentable in terms of looking at the unresolved nature of it in relation to my relationship with this character in cancer and all these other men that I was working with in order to be able to produce this piece.
So are the new boxes mixed up with the old boxes?
Yes, so all the image that you see, all the materials that you saw, some of them were the boxes, original boxes I had collected, and some of them were also boxes that I had constructed using the old remnants from the railways, canoe parts, like when you go to the seaside, the boats that were used by the fishermen, canoe parts, and also the factory that I collected a lot of the wood from for this. It was an old paint factory. So it had a lot of like paint and other things. So we had to rub the boxes within them. So it was an entire production system that happened. So when you saw it together with like ripped off parts of wood, because the factory doesn't exist anymore, they were going to burn it down. And also there were archives from it, which I collected, which became the basis for the archive at Red Clay. So photographs of workers constructing the factories at the time, because one of these factories was one of the factories that was built in post-independence Ghana by Kwame Nkrumah, which was supposed to be one of those things that were supposed to lead us towards a new economic transformations and like ideological positions and all that. So I was very much interested in how this history and the failures of all that was somehow embedded within this, within the residues, the memories within the walls, and how that could be transferred into the production of this work.
But equally, as an indexical object, they're very transportable, like you said, and
exactly
to actually take around.
Exactly.
Malik, could you go? I think the next shot should give a bit more detail of the thing. And then if you could go, so that's another angle. And then I think there's one that gives us sort of like a close up. So could you say a little bit about, because, it wasn't just that you put all these things in the room and piled them up. There was a quite careful orchestration and almost like, set building of this sculpture. So can you just say a little bit about what materials you're attracted to actually include in the work?
Well, there were different kinds of materials. There were like album covers. There were some of the wood. After we had produced everything, we burnt them. We literally put them in fire to char them. We created holes in some of them. We bought materials like shoe talkings, We bought glue and poured glue onto some of them and dipped them in sand. We put paint on some of them. So at the end of the day, when we were doing the composition, and it also had rubber tire parts, when we're composing, I think I also gave the freedom to the guys at the gallery who were installing the work. So they found a rhythm in which they could install and have different surfaces against one another based on the color or like patination or whatever. So at the end of the day, they did most of the work. I like this idea that in building work in my studio, that is where my interest most in. It's how to conceive the idea. But once the idea is conceived and the work is done, I'm also interested in how people can take responsibility for it. And I very much took this idea from Ellen Achi when we're studying in art school and looking at his work, and this idea that he always talks about the fact that when he sends the work to the museum, he's very much interested in how the curators also take a responsibility for the form that it takes within the space. And for me, it's not also so much about just the curators and all that, but it's also just about the people who are installing the work, the technicians, like decisions that they make, because a lot of this work was produced by ordinary folks back home. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Having just watched the technicians de-installing a show at where I work, you're absolutely right, and lots of them embrace that as well. And it's interesting. Could you go on to the next slide, please, Malik? So, and then the next one, and the next one. I think we can get a bit of a closer. Can you say a little bit about Old
Fadama? So Old Fadama, it was an archive that I had collected, which was these geographical maps from the 50s of looking at like different geographical locations around the world. I collected them from a library because we're going to discard them. At some point, I was also interested in collecting data. I was building these archives, which was basically collecting like information from a lot of the collaborators. I was working with young women who had migrated from the north of Ghana to the south, but a lot of them didn't have passports, birth certificates, or whatever. So I started building these fictional birth certificates for them. And even we made some of them that even we used it to make passports, which later on we traveled to Documenta with for Documenta 14. But I was also interested in how I could combine this new archive that I was making together with like this existing archive. So I printed the information that we had generated with the birth certificates onto this. And it was collected from an area called Old Fadama, which is this big industrial site in Ghana where it's the largest e-waste site in the world where they dump all the electronic waste. It's a very densely populated area. That is where I collected this information from. So I was very much interested in this idea of combining this data that I collected from there together with like archival material, which was related to like the geographical positions within the world and how it could look like in the drawing form. So that was it.
I was very struck by how beautiful these sheets of paper looked in the next room to where the shoe boxes were. But also I wanted to ask you about your relationship to the idea of the archive, because there's two ways that people and particularly artists consider it. They either consider it with complete reverence, where they sort of like lovingly try and reproduce it, or reproduce the idea of what it was, or they disregard it and they use it as a resource. Which one do you feel that you're?
I think for me, it's both of them. When I collect materials, archives, I use them in any way. Like archives, I've used them in parts of the buildings in the institution. I've used them in making drawings or paintings. I have kept them as they are, as a form that we could just preserve for the sake of preservation. The airplanes, the train parts, and all those other things that I've collected as archives, we use them for classroom projects, for teaching technological processes, for contemplations, as bedrooms, as anything. Anything can happen within it. And I also for inspiration to be able to build, let's say, new architectural forms in the context of the Parliament of Ghosts and also the archive in Tamale. So for me, it's not something that is just supposed to be protected, but it's also something which is meant to be expanded upon, because for me, it's a living thing that can take on different forms. So it's not just something that we should sit on and just revere and say that, oh, but this is from this era and we have to know. I'm interested in how we can push even the boundaries of it in terms of the aesthetics.
Great. Malik, can you go on to the next slide, please? So we're going to move on to a different section called local development, which is your local development. So this is a picture that's not from the gallery or you, but it's one that I took when I came to visit you. And it was the first, when the foundations and some of the early building of Red Clay Studios at Tamale was started. Could you just say a little bit about your idea for this space?
Well, Red Clay, it was started in the same period when I was invited to All the World's Futures by Queen Wezo back then in 2015. We started building the foundation in the same month when the exhibition opened. And it also ties back to this idea of the art school in Kumasi. Then again, Caricature Seidu and his group were not just interested in artists producing works, but they were interested in artists building communities or expanding communities in different areas in different forms. So I had many conversations with Caricature outside the classroom where we talked about ways in which artists, his concern was always how artists could somehow build new forms of communities that could inspire a new generation of artists and thinkers to stress on that, the idea that art could cause this kind of a new cultural revolution. And people who would not even be the artists would be the allies that would somehow help us to be able to resolve some of the conditions that we have. So I thought, why not build a studio that's in Tamale, where I was born but was not raised, maybe which could inspire something different. It could inspire maybe children to want to become artists one day or whatever. And when I started building it, I realized that we had artists like Kofi Dawson, Ajimano Se, whom I worked with Red Clay from the beginning, who had been doing their practice for many years, but there was not any sense of engagement with their practice on a national level because I don't think Ghana has been the best with regards to building like cultural institutions and all that. So I thought that, we could convert this space into like a cultural institution. So that's how come Red SCCA was born. And subsequently, when Red Clay was also started within the same period, I would like to keep it as an artist studio, but I would want to expand what the notion of an artist studio is. What is an artist studio? Is it a place where the artist keeps in isolation and produces objects? Or is it a place where the artist somehow produces time and space and allows for an audience to become part of it, together with an archives, pedagogical spaces, agriculture, or whatever a constellation technology, whatever it could be, to allow for us to be able to have new sets of conversations regarding, let's say, what artistic forms could be. So that is where this whole...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. That's where this whole idea came about. Just the idea of experimenting with artistic form. Because if an artist is making like the exhibition at White Cube Fragments, and all that, it will be produced anyway. But I'm also interested in when that idea of fragments comes into being, when it goes into the art world and it converts it into capital. That capital can come back in a form of, for instance, building spaces like Red Clay, which would even allow for, currently we have the non-rentable in cancer at Red Clay, which school kids can go there and see, and there are workshops around it. And they can see it the same way children in London would have seen the non-rentable, or children in Boston or people in Boston would see the current iteration of non-rentable there. So for us, it was more or less about how the processes that we were creating, the work that we were creating, how does the work grow up to a certain point where it allows us to revisit this idea of justice in a way of redistribution of, let's say, artistic forms.
It'd probably be helpful if we went through some slides now, because then you'll see. So that was when I went, and then if you could, and that's sort of some more of the stuff that Ibrahim collects that I was fascinated with. But if you keep going, Malik. Now, do you want to say something? So this is it, one of the spaces, because there are a number of spaces that are of very large sizes, but this is one of them. Do you want to say a little bit about this particular exhibit?
Interestingly enough, this is not an exhibition. This is a constellation of forms in the Parliament of Ghosts. It's a series of ideas that I was working on. And I collected all these materials. For instance, this is like scales coming from Birmingham, from England, in like the mid 20th century, pre-post-independence Ghana. A lot of them were in factories, which were later on demolished, and the lands were sold to like foreign investors and all that. And I'm interested in how these objects also are like part of the witnesses of, let's say, our industrial age, and also like a certain golden moment within our history in a way. So I've collected a lot of these objects like 6-7 years ago. And in the building of the parliament, which was an extension of the red clay, which was inspired by this exhibition I did at Whitworth in Manchester in 2019. And I decided to build it as an architectural form as part of red clay. So I decided that I was going to somehow build a space which would allow for a constellation of objects to come together to have conversations rather than just building it for people. So I've done very different forms of like constellations within this space, which you have images, some of the images of.
Yeah. So can you go on to the next image, please? So
so things like this.
Same space?
Yeah, it's in the same space.
And what tree is that? What sort of tree is that?
That's a share tree.
Okay.
The one that they produce the share oil from. Then also on the floor, you have ash from the forest, because during the dry season, locally people burn the forest, and in order to be able to catch these small rats, it's like a delicacy. And there's a way that burning the forest also replenishes the earth. But I was more interested in like these testing aesthetics, color and form within these spaces. Imagine it's an artwork, but it's an artwork which is born out of the exhumation of the earth, which is related to the Kwame Nkrumah silo in Tamale, the Nkrumah Volne, which we acquired during the era of the beginning of the pandemic, COVID. And we had to exhume the building in order to be able to bring it back to life and create this new cultural institution. But I was also interested in how we could create this juxtaposition between exhuming a building from the 1960s and exhuming like old ideological forms and memories versus exhuming a space and building a parliamentary form into the ground that could lead us into a new era of, for instance, rethinking about time and then its implication on, let's say, a generation of artists and thinkers, and how we could somehow draw connections between different times in our own world history.
I mean, looking at this image as well, I can see the sort of like the openings at the back on back walls. So it's open for people just to sort of like wander in and out and to explore.
Yes.
Okay. Malik, can you go on to the next image, which will show a very different configuration? So who are these?
So these are school kids coming in for a visit at Red Clay. And it happens all the time because we center our program mostly on school kids. And because of the way the space was designed and it was dug into the floor, when it rains, naturally the space collects water. So even sometimes the kids in the community in the village, because Red Clay is in Tamale, in a rural community, and it's surrounded by villages. And then sometimes the kids come there to swim in the water. So we also use the same water in order to be able to build the space. We use it to mix cement, and then that's what we use in the building of the institution. So I like to think that in the building of the institution, it's not as if we are building a space which it's done and we're like, hey, yeah, we built this space for another generation. But we're also very much interested in building. It's like registering information on a memory disk or a disk, where these children are like these disk that we are registering different forms of information of the idea of building an institution, because the institution is not just an architectural form, but it's a work of art in itself that contains all these different ideological positions and also aesthetical positions, and also different ways of looking at the world and seeing. So when they experience these spaces, every day that they come, it's different. Sometimes they come, there's water in it. Sometimes they come, there's no water. Sometimes there's bricks on the floor. Sometimes they come to do musical performances in it. Sometimes their teachers come to teach them in it. Sometimes they come, there's an airplane in the space. So sometimes they come, there's an artist who's done an installation in the space. So I like this idea that throughout the excavation and building of the space, it's allowed us to somehow be able to insert ourselves in it, almost as if we're some kind of time travelers. And in the next kind of...
Sorry, I was going to ask, how easy was it to persuade the teachers that you wanted to work this way with the children?
It's not difficult per se, because for us, it's simple. It's work that we're doing. We're investing our lives into it. And we want to be able to produce work that somehow shifts the way art is thought about, so that in the next 20, 30 years, when these children are adults and they are in a position of power, their relationship to art and culture would not be the same as it was in our father's generation or even within our own time. So it's like you're sowing seeds that would only bear fruits in the future. And in order to be able to do that, you just do it honestly. We just tell the teachers that this is what we're doing. We have this institution and we write letters to the educational ministry and the municipality and say, we would like to invite the students. And once the students come, they become these young ambassadors. Even they get so excited. And when they go home, they tell their parents. And the next time you see them, they are with their parents. Because ordinarily their parents would not come. Their parents, when they come, they say, oh, we heard some time ago that there was this crazy artist who was building this institution out here. But their kids were super excited once they came there with the school. And suddenly it's giving their parents a new form of, taking new form of position to the way that the institution operates.
Okay. Malik, I think you've got an example of some adults. I think the next slide. Oh no, this is another one. So this is
next slide.
Other configuration.
Yeah, this is Selom. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the people. This is Assemblyman, our caretaker. His name is Zachariah, and he's taking like the kids. I said people from the community through like the archive at Red Clay. And this is a photograph. Some of the photographs that I've made. Some of these were shown in Manchester at the Whitworth. And also in Chicago at SIAC when I made this exhibition, part of a group show some years ago. And this was the point that the cabinets that this photograph is in, one of the cabinets coming from the railway, it was made by the British in the early 20th century for the preservation of the plans and drawings of the trains and also photographs of like the railway system that was being built. And I like the idea of presenting these photographs in these cabinets, just as the other archives that we have. That Assemblyman as himself, he is one of the people that has contributed his labor to the building of the institution these last couple of years. And he's always there. He's there more than I or any other person in the history of the building of the institution. So that was one of the radical points that Kumasi, the radical education, was supposed to do. That how do we produce art that transforms from the state of commodity into a gift? And the gift is not just a matter of, let's say, the paintings or sculptures or whatever, but it's also the radical transformation of the people who we claim that we're building institutions or we're making art for. Because Assemblyman now, when people come together with his son Latif or other people living in the community, they can actually take people on a tour through the institution and describe different forms of work, whether it is contemporary or the archive or whatever, or the building of the institution in terms of its memory, whether in the future or in the past or in the present, to the same people of their own kind. Because you imagine that if before there were no cultural institutions and no one would go, it didn't exist before, so you didn't even go. And now that it exists, there is a danger that it might only be for a group of people who can afford to go there or afford the luxury of thinking that they can go there, not just financially, but also like in their mind, imaginatively. So now these people are just ordinary folks who would only dress up because they're going for a funeral, outdooring, or they're going for some kind of an event. But the fact that they can get up in the morning and dress up and say that, oh, we're taking our baby or our children to the artist studio or to the cultural institution, and they get there and there is someone ordinary just like them who would even describe the processes or the works to them in the local language. Of course, I do it sometimes, and like Salom, the artistic director of SCCA, and then my other colleagues, Sakite, Esinam, Benjamin, Francis, we all do it. But the idea that locally, there are people who have a certain implicated labor within the formation of the space can somehow be able to translate these materials or convey this. I think there is a lot of meaning within that and promise. And that is what I think that the promise of the art school in Kumasi brought to this, to art making in Ghana.
Yeah, so it's sort of like coming full circle, really. So
yes,
well, it's great to see those images. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Malik? So this is the outside of one of the buildings, and just to say, I mean, there's about 4 or 5 of these buildings. It's not just the one that houses the Parliament of Ghosts. So it's a pretty big site and, very inspiring. And can you go to the next slide, Malik? Which is, I think, so this is the Savannah Centre for Contemporary Art. So it's in a different space that the Red Studios is. So, and do you want to say what goes on here? Because I think, again, it's a really special space. with a library and exhibition space
Yeah.
and everything.
Yeah, this was the first space that was started. It was built on a piece of land that my father owned more than 40 years ago. And when I told him I wanted to come to Tamale to build a studio, he was very excited. So he gifted the land to me, and we started building this. So he as an engineer, he helped us to build it from the ground up. And at the time, Professor Caricature was encouraging students to write their thesis on older artists, one of whom was Dawson, and one of our colleagues, Ajokise, who is a teacher at the art school. She was doing her thesis on Dawson's work. So I became very interested in it. And I spoke to my colleague, Bernard Quay Jackson, who is also a professor at the university. He curated this exhibition of Dawson's work. That was what opened up the institution. So then we decided together, why not work with, of course, we've always worked with students in various exhibitions who contributed their labor, Elolo, Gidisu, like all the artists from the university, young artists who've contributed their labor significantly to the building, like building up different artists' works and all that. So we said, okay, fine. Why don't we dedicate this space at a retrospective space, a space where we'll try as much as possible to use it almost like an archaeological site where we can do exhibitions of artists' works dating back some decades.
Yeah, because
so
the artist, gosh, I can't remember, Lawson, he had stopped practicing to be a practicing artist a long time ago, because is he in his 60s or 70s?
No. Dawson, may so rest in peace. He died last year, but he was 82. He was about 82, 83 when he died, you know.
Yeah.
He studied at the Slade Art School at some point. He was also one of the founding students of our program in Kumasi, the fine arts program, the painting and sculpture program. So he himself as a protagonist within this whole story of like art education. He was one of the very few artists, older generation, that every exhibition you'll see him there. He was very much interested in art and also young artists' works and what it meant to the future of art. So for us, it was imperative that his work was the first thing that would open this institution.
Yeah, and I think that sense of sort of like, intergenerational memory is really important, as well, because there is this sort of like thing whereby people always think, oh, it's only going to be the emerging artists, it's only going to be sort of like, no, I'm just sort of saying. And so I think, again, that it was, very important fact.
Yeah.
Malik, could you go on to the next slide? And just to sort of, this is just to, I'm going to open it up to questions just after I ask you this question about when your work travels. So we now left Ghana, but you're still taking that material and those ideas and that work to other places. And so this is an example of a show that we worked on together, which was Nuit Blanche in 2018. And Malik, could you just run through the couple more slides where you did a big sculptural piece that sort of, couldn't quite envelop the whole of the building because the building is so huge. But if you can see from the size of the people how much material was needed to even do that section of the town hall, which is in the sort of like the center of Toronto, which is where the town hall is. But also it was the site that had the first Black church and the first sort of like Black settlers in the city. I was just wondering whether you could say a little bit about what's in your mind about what you hope that people are going to encounter when they see your work in other places.
Well, I guess as an artist, when you're making work, of course, you're making it from a local context, but there's so much global perspectives which is implicated within the work, the aesthetics and the forms, and particularly coming from Africa and making work. There's always this tendency that when people see it, they're like, oh yeah, because of the materials that are involved in it, oh, because there's a certain sense of poverty around the material. So people tend to think, oh, because maybe they don't have paint. That's why they use these kinds of impoverished materials. But it's more difficult and expensive to produce this kind of work. It's very meticulous and also very deliberate and intentional to be able to buy new materials, almost like canvases, and exchanging them for old canvases. So I was hoping that the processes of making it an intense labor process, when it gets to a certain point, it begins to have global implication. So when people see this work in Nuit Blanche or in New York or in London or elsewhere in the world, I think that based on different experiences, people take different things away from it with regards to how their own histories, art itself, or even beyond art. Because in Ghana, most of the projects that I did were not in direct references to art, but in the context of, for instance, New Blanche, it was an art festival. So for me, it was also very important to how people could somehow go into like the substructural aspect of the work in terms of looking at like details of the work and also looking at the relationship of the work to, for instance, the architectural form that it was.
Yeah, Malik, could you go on to the next slide? And then I've got a few questions that have been posed. So as time went on, more and more people came, so it was pretty crowded. So,
yeah,
very crowded.
Yeah, this was very intense.
There's a question about that's saying that you've made references to sort of like music and literature, and talking about songs and album covers and books. And could you talk a bit more about the forms of the sort of like culture that you get inspiration from and how that influences you artistically? So, for example, what music do you listen to and what do you read? And how does it form?
Well, in terms of music, I'm very much open when I'm listening to music, but sometimes maybe when I'm working on a specific project, maybe I might just give myself a direction. Recently, there's a show that I'm currently working on in Nantes in France. And I went back to this idea of like building these archives out of like old vinyls. So like high life music coming from Ghana from the 50s to like 80s. I'm working with this family in Accra to collect all these like vinyls, which used to belong to like an old Ghanaian DJ who willed his collection to his grandchildren. So the idea of using that as a point of inspiration to build this set exhibition space where people could come to Nantes to listen to these old vinyls, which also I think at some point inspired textile productions and other things. So yeah, so it depends on what the project is. But randomly, when I'm just moving or in town or living, I just listen to music randomly. But if I have to work on a project and I need maybe some kind of an inspiration or direction, I might just pick something and then see which direction that it takes me in.
Okay, and we've got another question, which I think might have to be the last one. And who are some of the other artists whose work you admire?
Well, when it comes to artists, there's so many artists that I've been inspired by. In the beginning, there were one of the early artists that really inspired me when I was in art school was Robert Rauschenberg, the American painter. I really liked the way that he was using materials, his composition of forms and all that. And of course, Robert Smithson, what's his name? Christo and Jean-Claude, Yinka Shunibari, of course, in his use of like the wax print and the histories that came along with Santiago Sierra. There were photographers also, Gorsky and many others, Anna Mendieta. Yeah, so they're cut historically in terms of looking at like modern art, like both modern, contemporary. But of course, like in the more contemporary, as students, we had these references, but more or less, even the people that we're studying with, an artist like Bernard Akwe Jackson, who was like an artist in like when we were doing our undergrad or MFA, it was very inspiring to find an artist who was coming from the same educational background, who was like doing international work and whose work really mattered in terms of how it was shifting the way that art was being thought about or practiced. So, and of course, Caricature Sedu, who was an artist trained as a painter, but his practice wasn't necessarily about producing objects, but more or less about producing artists. So I like the idea that I could borrow different forms and also look at technology, like in various different disciplines. So the idea that we could somehow take inspiration from both artists and non-artists, practicing artists in object forms and practicing artists from philosophical, ideological forms. So all those things mattered.
Okay, so I think our time's up now, and it's just gone so quickly. So I really want to thank you for a very rich and expanded conversation. I feel like I was trying to get in a few things, but you spoke so well and so eloquently about the subjects that I thought it was sort of like worth letting you continue. And there are lots more questions, but I think, you know, we're having to call it to a close. So I really want to thank you for your time and congratulate you again on all the work that you're doing both at home in Ghana and, you know, the work that we, you know, have the privilege of seeing in our art spaces outside of Ghana. I also want to thank Jane and Malik, who are part of the Yale University, for facilitating this and setting this up. And finally, I really want to thank the audience for staying with us and posing such good questions that I could only get a few in, but I hope that you would agree that we've had a very rich and fruitful hour with Ibrahim Mahama. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you have a very good weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ibrahim.